Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of the foXnoMad podcast. I'm your host, foXnoMad. My guests today I have two guests today. We have Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and Alastair Smith. They are the authors of the Dictator's Handbook, Why Bad Behavior is Almost Always Good Politics. We talk about that fascinating book and their theory, why politicians, why people in power, how they operate. And it's definitely enlightening. I think you're going to really find this episode fascinating. So here you go with Bruce and Alistair. Hello, Bruce, Alistair. Thanks for being on the podcast. Um, I wanted to have you guys on the podcast for a while. I love the Dictator's Handbook. It's something that I refer back to. So I see something on the news and I'm like, how, you, like, how does this thing that seems counterintuitive makes sense. And so I go back to it. And unfortunately, I guess there's a lot more, it seems a lot more relevant, just more and more examples. Um, how did you guys come up with the Dictator's Handbook? And can you describe a little bit about the book itself?
So back in the 1990s, we began to develop what has come to be known as selectorate theory. And we wrote a book called The Logic of Political Survival with two colleagues, Jim Morrow at University of Michigan and Randy Severson at the University of California, Davis, developing the selectorate theory in its initial foundation. We've expanded it quite a lot since. It's very technical work, a lot of math. Um, and so it was reaching an academic audience and having some real impact in the academic setting. And we thought it would really be useful if this were understood by people who don't read math. And so we made a decision to try to write it in plain English, no statistics, no mathematics, and yet trying to write it carefully so that everything that we have proven to be true logically is explained in ordinary language. And we hope we say nothing in the Dictator's Handbook that we can't prove. So we just decided we wanted to talk to a broader audience. We're now working on a follow-up book. The working title is Let's End Poverty. We've expanded the theory a great deal in a new technical book called Anticipating Instability that'll be out in about a year. And so we now want to write that in English as well.
Fascinating. So I guess if you were to describe the Dictator's Handbook to somebody who is trying to make sense of the world and how we get to this point where we have a dictatorship or an oligarchy or certain situations like this. You know, you mentioned before we hit record that you said culture has nothing to do with it. It's a series of sort of logical steps that take place. How does that begin?
Well, the starting point and where I think most people get politics wrong is leaders are just in it for themselves. And we tend to think that the leaders are going to do the right thing. They're going to do things that make the people better off. They're going to have good economic policy. That's not what leaders are about. Leaders are about coming to power and staying in power. And typically, the things that get leaders into power and help them stay there are actually not the things that are good for the people. So, there's a very common idea people focus on this idea of poverty traps. There's something horribly wrong. It's nature, there's disease, there's natural disasters, the government's not capable of implementing the good policies it knows to do. We have the much more cynical policy, belief here is that leaders are actually doing what's good for them, and keeping the people poor is often a good way to survive in power, right? So if we've really started spending a lot of time comparing North and South Korea. I mean, if you look at North Korea, it's had three leaders. They've all died in their sleep. Two of them have died in their sleep. South Korea, we're up to close to 2020. I forget the exact number, but we're getting
18.
close
It's
to
18 currently.
18 presidents, right? I mean, and we're sitting there, and the guys that were in the long time, that's when South Korea was much poorer and less well governed than North Korea. So we sit there and think South Korea is the big success story, but not if you think about it from being the leader. The Kims, they eat wonderfully. They have wonderful houses. They have servants. They have everything materially they could want. And South Korean presidents, they try and stay in power and they end up being arrested, right? So this is where we just find that people think, South Korea is a success story. Not if you're the political leader. If you're the political leader, North Korea is the success story. And that's just basically our takeoff point is, yeah, we think North Korea is a terrible place, but it's not, you want to think about who's picking as being the leader. And from the leader's perspective, things are very different than from the people's perspective. And we, of course, think we have this innate belief that people are trying to do the right thing. And they are doing the right thing. They're doing the right thing for them, not for the people.
So, it kind of draws parallels to like the mafia or what we think of the mafia in terms of movies and things. So my question is, you always see in those kind of dynamics that if you don't treat people well, they tend to take somebody out, right? It tends to cause like some kind of revolution in a small, let's say when you don't have a lot of people. Is the dynamic different with larger groups, or am I getting something wrong? In other words, if you want to stay in power,
So,
don't you want people to be well off,
so
right?
the the fundamental foundation behind the way we think about the world, as Alastair said, we assume everybody is looking out for themselves, and we are focused on dividing all societies into readily discernible groups. There are people who aspire to be the leader. They have a winning coalition, some number of people who are essential to keep them in office. In a democracy, that's a very big number. You need a lot of voters. In North Korea, it's maybe a few dozen generals, senior civil servants, and so forth. And there is a pool of people, a selectorate, from which that winning coalition is drawn. Those are the people who could be in the winning coalition. So when the winning coalition, leaders in our view of the world do three things. They raise revenue through taxation and so forth. They spend money on public goods designed to benefit everybody, private goods like corruption opportunities designed to benefit their inner circle, and any money that they didn't have to spend to keep their coalition loyal to them is left over for them to do with what they want, which might be civic-minded projects and it might be a secret bank account. So when the coalition is very large, it's too expensive. The implicit price of corruption opportunities is how many people you have to give it to. Your winning coalition. If the winning coalition is very large, you have to give it to too many people. You produce more public goods, more good policy. If the coalition is small, the efficient way to stay in power is to bribe those few people by making them rich and produce very few public goods. So the logic of government is no different in a democracy than in an autocracy. All that's different is how many people you depend on. Leaders always want to depend on as few people as possible. The citizens always want the leader to depend on as many as possible. The pivotal group that helps to shape how a society works is the winning coalition. They can benefit if the coalition is very small, they get lots of goodies, but they could also benefit if the coalition is sufficiently large, in which case there's sufficient good education, infrastructure, and so forth that those who are capable can become quite rich. So that's the tension in any society. Is the coalition aligned with the leader or aligned with the large mass? The masses have a big problem. They may be miserable if the leader exploits them, as is true in North Korea, but successfully rising up is a very rare event. Revolts that succeed are very rare. The theme of our forthcoming book, Anticipating Instability, is that leaders are constantly looking for signals that people are getting ticked off, either the masses or people in their coalition who might plot a coup, and they take action in anticipation, hence the title, to offset the threat. So we see very few revolutions. We see relatively few coups in the world, but we see lots of adjustments in suppression, torture, killing people, corruption, and institutions. And those adjustments are made to avoid the people rising up or the coalition rising up.
And
No
you know,
culture in any of that.
and so uh, which is interesting. Still, and also, but I guess when you put it like that, like the motivation is really the same for the leader and as well for the coalition and the different parts. I guess it's easier if you're in power to predict a potential trouble, right, in the masses, right? Because it moves slowly. Revolutions don't just happen. There people get, there are signs, people get upset, so they can kind of pivot quickly or much, they can kind of outmaneuver any kind of trouble. So,
Exactly.
but when you're coming to power, right, you don't tell people these things, right? Like, how do the promises to get to power translate into when you're actually in power? Why don't people see the divide there?
Alistair, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, you obviously always want to promise people wealth and happiness and peace and prosperity and all those wonderful things if you're trying to get their support. But you should never really believe those. They're always political promises. And yeah, I mean, going back, you would just sort of set up, I think, the question about, why don't people take you out when you don't do nice things for them? It's always relative to what they should expect to get under somebody else. And so that for us is the key thing. It's not that people are treated well in an absolute sense. It's that they're getting as much as they can expect to get under any other system. So you were talking about the mafia taking people out if they're not rewarded enough. That's a system where there are actually relatively few players at the top. So it's one of these systems where there's just not the replacements for being the supporter of the top boss is relatively small number of people. So if you do defect, there's a good chance that the next guy is going to still want you around. That's really not the case if you want to think about a popular revolution. So Castro comes to power and he has all these political followers. The vast majority of his co-revolutionaries end up dead. He takes them out and replaces them. So it's really hard to want to get behind changes. And so people know that yes, there's a promise that this person's going to keep you around and you're going to be an important person in the next government, right up until the point that, your key doesn't fit in the office door anymore and you find that you've been arrested. And that's the first thing you'll know about it. But people anticipate that this could happen. And sort of the beauty of the sort of I can say the communist system is just to have a ton of replacements. Because then this risk that you're going to be replaced under an alternative leader is so huge, right? So we're seeing the Communist Party in China. Xi Jinping's just slowly rotated everybody who was an important person under the previous leadership has just been rotated out. And one of the great things he's done is he's used corruption. He's just had people arrested for being corrupt. Well, of course, everyone's corrupt. That's how the system works. So everyone's guilty, but he just uses that. He's slowly replaced everybody. So if you're a current supporter of his, you don't have to be rewarded that well because well, the next guy that comes, if I bring him down, take him down, the next guy that's going to come in, well, they might have me arrested for corruption too. So you don't have to do so much for people. It's just this anticipation of being kept in. And this is the beauty for long established leaders is they've already done that rearrangement. So I think Xi is very securely in power in China now because he's done all this replacement, and people don't want to rock the boat because the next president that comes in might start replacing them and have them up for corruption charges. So they're very happy to get their rewards and stay very loyal. And that's sort of the beauty of this system of it's not getting absolutely large amounts, it's getting more than you can expect to get by getting rid of the leader. That's the key.
Hmm. And you mentioned in the book that the leaders don't want people who are too smart around them. There's maybe like a sort of a you want people who are competent enough, but not too smart because they could be a threat to you as the leader. And I am yeah.
I mean, this is a very common problem, right? The sort of vizier system. You want to have an advisor, but you don't want them to be a political threat. You know, one of the beauty of, like, for example, eunuchs is that eunuchs could never be the king or the emperor or whatever, and so they were perfect people to entrust for power because they could never actually have your job, and therefore they can be loyal and you reward them well, but they're not a political threat. And so there is always this tension between having capable people and having loyal people. And you know, in a large coalition system, we're talking democracies, it's good to have competent people because you need to deliver effective policy. That's in the US, the political currency is good public policy, things that people like, things that are going to make the economy grow. Those are important things. In North Korea, the important thing is loyalty. And so there's this trade-off. The more you need to deliver public goods, good public policy, the more you need to have competent leaders around you, competent supporters around you. And so there's this trade-off. It's not that people in democracy are brighter. It's just you have a selection bias towards putting ministers in charge who can deliver good public policy if you've got to keep a lot of people happy, or just people who are going to be loyal. And so there's this sort of trade-off going on here.
You want to really be very careful about what one means by competent. As Alastair says, in a democracy, you want people running the government who are competent to deliver effective public policies because you need a very large coalition to support you. In North Korea or in China or in any uh, small winning coalition autocracy, the competence that the leader cares about is the ability to bash heads in. It's not to deliver effective policy. People who can deliver effective policy might, as you indicated, attract supporters and become rivals. So if we look at the Khamenei regime in Iran, when people take to the streets and demonstrate, they bring out the Basij, a group of people who go out and bash heads. Their competence is not in running an effective government. Their competence is in making sure people know it's really costly to take to the streets. And who runs the Basij? Who is in charge of the Basij? Khamenei's son. So he's pretty confident he's going to be loyal.
And
That's
and
how it works.
and family ties are important because there's an inherent ideally an inherent trust there, right? In terms of, it's why you see that in a lot of dictatorships. You see people surround themselves with family because they're likely to be more able to trust someone who's blood related.
So,
Is that why we see that?
yeah, there's a better chance that they'll be loyal. We call this affinity in the theory, but it's also a two-edged sword because they are closest to the leader and so are in the best position, to go back to your earlier comment, to assassinate and so forth. You know, if you look at the history of dynastic Europe in the Middle Ages, half of the monarchic successions were contested, even though it was allegedly hereditary. And often the outcome was determined by, who was left standing after the swords were in play. When John was elected King of England in 1199, he had two principal rivals. He had the eldest living son, Arthur, of Henry II's older son, Gregory, who had died, who had a claim to the crown, and Eleanor of Aquitaine had a claim, Henry's wife. She was smart enough to know not to pursue it. She didn't want to wind up being dead. Arthur was not that clever, and he wound up being jailed and eventually murdered. And then, remarkably, John had all the support he needed. So the competence is in getting somebody who's willing to go out and do your dirty work if the coalition is small, and it's delivering good policy if the coalition is big.
And it seems like there's sort of a slide or a tendency to go toward dictatorship, right? It seems like sort of democracy is the aberration, right? It's not the norm, at least historically. And it seems like the
Hmm.
incentives are maybe set
I
up
wouldn't
for.
say that. So,
Mhm.
so this is going to have video, right?
Yep.
So the welfare of the winning coalition, this is the coalition getting bigger as we go this way. This is the individual's welfare. Looks just like this. When the coalition's very small, the coalition is getting lots of goodies. And so they are very fiercely loyal to the leader, and it's a dictatorship. As the coalition gets bigger, two things happen. You have to dilute the rewards for the coalition members because you're sharing the riches now with more people, and so begins to shrink. And the leader who wants as much money for himself as possible has to spend more of the revenue to keep the coalition loyal because what they're getting is getting diluted. So they start increasing public goods, and eventually this reaches a bottom and it turns up. So down here, the coalition is fiercely loyal to the idea of dictatorship. There's a cut point here, you see, where when the coalition is big enough, so the welfare coalition numbers is higher than it would be even if it were a dictatorship, then their interest is democracy. In between is the world of coups and so on. That's where all the turmoil takes place. So leaders can have their interests aligned with the dictator, but they can have their interests aligned with the people if the coalition gets big enough. And there are circumstances that drive it that way. So I don't think we would be comfortable saying dictatorship dominates democracy. We would also not be comfortable saying democracy dominates dictatorship. And we spend a lot of time studying the conditions that produce more democracy or more dictatorship.
But in both cases, the core is still the same, right? Leaders want to stay in power. That's the
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
And how
Yeah.
does
No changes in
oh yeah.
there's no changes in what we assume. We look at democracy and we look at it very cynically. Leaders want to shrink the winning coalition. That's what gerrymandering is for. That's what restricting voting rights is for. I want to exclude the people who aren't going to vote for me, or I want to pile them all up in one constituency so their votes don't have a big impact. And I want to make sure the folks who support me are going to have an easy time expressing their views. And I want to eliminate as many of the other people's votes as I possibly can.
And how does now, since you've the first edition of the book, since you came up with a theory actually, how does technology factor into this? Social media, misinformation, does it change anything or does it give an advantage to one side or the dynamics of how one might want to stay in power? Does it change anything or is it the same old tactics with new methods?
Well, I think we communications has changed a lot, and the way you get messaging out and the way you convince people of your views has the technology has changed, but fundamentally you're not trying to do anything different than you were before. I mean, the basic idea is you want people to support back you and oppose the opposition. We used to think if we would go back 200 years, we would have had fiercely partisan newspapers where people would read one local newspaper that said, the Democrats are awful, and we'd have had one that said the Whigs were terrible, and we would have had the same sort of slant bias that we tend to think of if we think of like Fox News as being, everything the Democrats do is terrible, and NBC, everything that the Republicans do is terrible. We just have different technology and different means of communication, but we're inherently doing the same thing. We're trying to get to power and stay in power. That's what being a political leader is about. And they're going to use whatever tool they can possibly find to do that. So I don't think the sort of on the ground how you actually communicate with people has changed, but inherently you're doing exactly the same thing. This is why
Essentially,
we
so
started off the conversation before we sort of came on air, talking about the sort of lack of culture. We culture's different between one country and another, but inherently political leaders are trying to stay in power, and it's sort of window dressing. I mean, we think of political parties as pretty much window dressing. It's if my party, we want to take things from other groups and redistribute them to our supporters. And when the other party are in, they want to take things that our party had given to us and give them to their supporters. So in the US, the Democrats, they want to tax the rich and have more social services. That's taking money from rich people who don't vote for them and giving it to poor people. And when the Republicans are in, they want to cut taxes on the rich and cut social services. It's just a transfer payment. We could put all kinds of ideological or cultural explanations on it, but it's just privileging the people that keep me in power, or keep you in power, and that's all that the fundamental way is going on. And ideology and culture is a good way of communicating to people that they're in my group, or you know it's a good way of communicating who the winners and losers are going to be in an easy way for people to understand. But there's nothing inherent about communism. Communism's just, you know, it's this big label, but it's just about transferring from the many to the few.
so social media, um, it's essentially an arms race, like any arms race. The nature, so I make a pitch for my understanding of the world, and somebody else makes the opposite pitch. Fox News, as Alastair points out, grows and becomes a big voice. MSNBC grows and becomes a big voice on the other side. The nature of arms races, whether it's of ideas or it's literally of arms, is that they make no difference of consequence unless you don't race. So you lose if you don't run the race, but as long as you run the race and the other guy runs the race, uh, it it should be in equilibrium. It should make little or no difference in outcomes. So I'm full agreement. Alistair and I have not actually talked about this. I'm in full agreement with what he has said on, it's a lot of window dressing. It gets a lot of attention. It doesn't fundamentally change the story. Leaders want what they want. People want what they want. Winning coalition wants what it wants. And how they express that is, the technology changes how they express it, but it doesn't alter the objectives or the maneuvering. The strategies remain the same.
And I know there are probably people listening and watching who are thinking, but that person I supported, they got into it to help me or to do this good thing. You know, how
Sorry,
do
I'm gonna laugh at that. Yeah, that may have been their objection on day one, that I want to make the world a better place. And
Mhm.
the classic case would be the revolutionary, right? The revolutionaries, they want to create democracy. They want to uplift the downtrodden, right up until the point now they're in charge. And those kinds of policies are going to make it really hard for them to stay in power. And maybe they tell themselves a story that, they have to sort of suppress people's right to protest, because otherwise, the bad side will come back to power. But basically, once they're in, their incentives shift. So let's think of a really extreme case. Aung San Suu Kyi, a Nobel Peace Laureate, lauded for years as being this poor person fighting for the rights of the Burmese people, right up until she's in political power and she's committing genocide. Uh, it's the same person. She, in one setting, was fighting to uplift down the downtrodden, and then once she's in power, it's like, yeah, the minority group, they're a bit of a threat. Let's have them murdered. It's the same person. It's about incentives.
Mhm.
Um, And what I'll do to
Alistair,
come to power and what I'll do when I am in power is very different. You know, the classic case we like to look at is as King Leopold of Belgium. So Leopold, I think, is basically the only person who is the ruler of two countries, you know, and not in a colonial relationship. So he actually independently owned the Belgian Congo, well, it became the Belgian Congo, but it was basically his own little fiefdom. And in Belgium, where he was responsible, accountable to a parliament and large numbers of people, he had moderate policies, labor reform, tried to fight some social welfare, and he was a brutal murderer in the Congo. It's because the institutions have changed, and what's effective at keeping you in power in one place is very different. You know, you don't go around murdering people in democracy, or put it this way, you don't openly go around murdering people in democracy. But that's exactly what you should do if you run a brutal dictatorship. And so it's people respond to the political incentives. They're just trying to stay in power.
when Aung San Suu Kyi came to power in Myanmar, Alistair and I wrote a piece. Hillary Clinton made a speech about how great this was. Myanmar's on the way to democracy. And we said, not so fast. What the logic of the theory tells us, takes us back to an earlier question of yours, is new leaders act as if they're reformers. They haven't figured out where the money is yet. They haven't picked a loyal coalition yet. They got a lot of problems. So they look like they're reformers. Once they figure out who's loyal and who's not, and once they figure out where the money is, if they can get away with it, they are no longer reformers. They are no longer liberalizers. They are no longer Democrats. And so we said, don't be so quick to judge her as being a Democratic leader. Give it a couple of years. You may discover that once she knows where the money is and who's loyal, she will look just like any other dictator. And unfortunately, we were right. She engaged in genocide.
And is, you know, are the incentives there for dictatorship when the institutions, the checks and balances aren't there? In other words, it was, you know, there weren't the it. I guess the question I'm getting at is, like, I think of, let's say, for example, in the United States, right? So you have like a George Washington type, and could have been a king after the Revolutionary War, could have been a dictator, but sets, you know, they decide, or, you know, through this long process, set up a democracy. How does that happen in one scenario versus a scenario like in Myanmar, for example?
So um, very few revolutions lead to democracy. There are some that do, and they do typically, and Washington's a good example of this, when the leadership of the revolution depends to win the revolution on a large coalition. So Washington is depending on the political leadership in 13 colonies. He's not, unlike Fidel Castro, who was just depending on his coterie of supporters. Washington is depending on people who didn't agree with him. And the same was true in India in 1947, 1948. It was a multi-party system. In most cases, there's a single leader of a revolutionary movement, a Fidel, a Mao, what have you, Jomo Kenyatta. They don't have to please a lot of other people. And so then it's much, as Alastair said, it's much easier once you're in the role of leader to do what's good for the leader rather than what's good for the people. Washington hated being a leader. And I would note one of the mythologies of American political history is that all subsequent presidents followed Washington's lead of not seeking more than 2 terms. So uh, if we skip past Andrew Jackson, so the early presidents who only had 2 terms, all were very elderly people. Jackson was 70, Madison, Monroe, late 60s, Jefferson, late 60s, and each one picked his own successor. If we go past that, every president of the United States before the Term Limit Act, a constitutional amendment, every president of the United States who was alive at the end of a second term sought a third term. It's just not true that they were ready to step aside and follow the Washington lead. Ulysses S. Grant was the leading candidate for the nomination of his party for a third time, but I think it was 19 ballots. He was defeated. I can go through all of them. They all tried. Theodore Roosevelt ran for a third term. He lost. Um, Even Woodrow Wilson, who was practically dead at the end of his second term, tried to get the party to nominate him for a third term. So they really do want to stay in power. That's how it works.
Interesting. And so it seems these days that there are more, a lot of democratic institutions are sliding in a lot of countries where, in the West, and we see sort of more oligarchies taking place, and countries kind of sliding toward, I guess, if there's a spectrum, toward a dictatorship, or illiberal democracies. Is there a reason for that happening now? Is this just kind of a wave? Do these things go in cycles? Why does that seem to be happening?
Well, I think that it's always in the leader's interest to try and shrink the number of people they're beholden to. So that they always have this constant motivation. And the masses, the people, the disenfranchised or the political outsiders, their interest is always in expanding the coalition, having more democracy. And so the balance here is really, can you get the members of the coalition, the people you're beholden to stay in power, to go along with a contraction, or are they going to side with the people? And I think that a large amount of the current democratic backsliding has sort of been overstated. And the places where backsliding is likely to be successful is places with sort of very low productivity, because the advantages of democracy it really extend is really extentuated when we've got a really productive society, because that's when, if we've a highly productive democratic system, that's really in the coalition's interest to keep expanding it in that direction. So earlier, Bruce was talking about this sort of what he likes to call the swoosh curve. It's once we're productive and we've got a large number of people, we're going to make ourselves, it's better to be a political loser in a large coalition productive system than a political winner in a contracted political system. So,
When the
if
system's
this is
productive,
how
the
I like
slope is steep. And when it's not productive, as in India, for example, the slope is flat. So that intersection happens way, way later.
So I mean, I like to think of, like, the Trump's attempt to have a coup, get people. There weren't that many people showed up and, invaded the Congress, and certainly the military and the police were not on board to back him. And I think the reason is, do you want to live in a less accountable system, even if it's under your guy, or would you sooner live with those awful, terrible Democrats with their woke agenda? But they're going to be highly accountable to a large number of people. So they're going to do good public policy. And so sort of our trade-off, it's better to be on the losing, it's better to be sort of not a political insider, but when the leaders held account. And so we we should all be concerned about democratic backsliding, but it's precisely because our interests are enhanced by having competitive elections and making leaders accountable, that we're going to fight to keep those, because it's in our political interest to do so. As Bruce was saying, when societies are much less productive, and so India is a great chance, still got terrible education, things are very corrupt, they don't work very well. The incentives to have democracy are actually lower. That, in some sense, the sort of marginal return from good public policy is low, because governments are very bad at doing public policy when society is very poor and uneducated. And so the advantages of being democratic are smaller. And we're actually doing quite a lot of work at the moment thinking about sort of trade-offs between, the classic public good is political freedom. So there's actually tons of political freedom in India, but they don't produce they produce similar levels of sort of public goods, education and healthcare that we see in China, which is a very small, relatively similar level of corruption, but zero freedoms or very few freedoms in China. So these the goods that you society is going to be great if we can get to a productive large coalition system. So I think we're good in the United States, but we should always be on the lookout for our political leaders trying to enact rules, and we should, whatever they tell us about how good this legislative reform will be, we should be always thinking it's in their interest to make the coalition smaller. So we should always be wary. But I'm not too concerned about democratic backsliding in productive, fully democratic countries.
No country past this cut point, uh, democracy up in here, none have stopped being democratic. Places that you were referring to, like illiberal democracies like Hungary, were below that cut point. Everybody who's above that cut point remains democratic, or at least has for the last 200 years.
Well, unless they get invaded.
Well, unless they get invaded. Yes, that's a
Right.
different, they don't choose to stop being democratic.
And I guess as we wrap things up on the other end of the spectrum, let's take a place like North Korea, where, I mean, it is right, it seems like change there is very unlikely to happen. How would a change there happen? How would we move to the other part of the swoosh? I have some guesses, but I'll let you uh, uh, take it.
Well, it's incredibly difficult to um, change North Korea. Um, Kim has no interest in doing it, and he has he has a loyal bunch of cronies who live in Pyongyang, and materially they have a reasonably good lifestyle, and certainly so much better than they would be if they weren't inside his coalition. And so these people are very scared of losing their jobs, and so they're going to be very loyal. So the time that there's two immediate ways that Kim could get in trouble. One is he completely runs out of money. Well, we want to be a little careful there. You don't need that much. He's not paying people that well, so he doesn't need that much money to stay in power. So that's, the economy's falling apart, but the economy fell apart in Zimbabwe for 20 years, didn't do Mugabe any great problems. So I don't see that as the big problem. Basically, his problem will be when he becomes really ill or when we have a new successor comes in. So when we have a new person coming in, or the current leader is on death's door, political loyalty evaporates because we know there's going to be a change in leadership. The supporters know that their good times are potentially going to come to an end. And so they got to sit there and think about what's the next leader. Well, they don't want when you see leadership changing, all of a sudden being a crony of Kim is not such a great thing, because you might not be the crony of the next person coming in. And so the coalition has an incentive to back reforms. And that's basically the only time you're going to lock in reforms in places like North Korea.
So let me give you a concrete example of when a place could become democratic. North Korea not being a good candidate, as Alastair has pointed out, because they're way down here. But so this curve is defining at any point for the size coalition, what is the right amount to pay the coalition members so that they don't want to back somebody else. They'll remain loyal to you. So imagine you're somewhere in this region, not at the very bottom. Maybe you're Venezuela, maybe you're Russia, maybe you're modern Cuba, what have you. Imagine the leader is overpaying the coalition. They're above this curve. Okay. Why would they be paying too much? Well, if you remember the coalition, you're going to think, oh, well, they might be making a mistake. They're going to correct it, move this way. Or they may be thinking about purging people, make the coalition smaller, more money left over for them by paying those who remain the same amount as over here, but fewer people. What do I do about that? I better make a coup. If I want to make a coup, I got to get everybody on board with me in the coalition. How am I going to do that? I have to guarantee them that they're going to remain in the coalition. Way to do that. Expand it. Make it more democratic. So when you think there's a serious threat of a coup, then you move this way and you get some democratization. When you think there's a serious threat of a revolution, you become more autocratic. Coups, a high percentage of the time, even when they haven't happened, that is, just the leader believes there is this threat. The, the adjustment is make the country more, not less, more accountable, more democratic. That doesn't mean make it all the way democratic, but move in that direction to buy off the threat. That's how democracies come to be.
That well, I appreciate both of you being on the podcast and explaining this because I think we don't want to believe that our leaders are selfish. I think in general, we some of you know I think it kind of is counterintuitive to a point. In a democracy, for example, where you are voting for the next, whoever leader, local, national, whatever. I don't think people go into it thinking I want to vote for the person that I like, but also who's they're going to be just as selfish to stay in power as the other person. I think you know, but it makes sense, but it's a tough pill to swallow, I think, for a lot of people.
Well,
There's
but
a
the thing is,
reason that
democracy is the things that you have to do to keep tens of millions of people happy and loyal supporters. It tends to be good public policy. So they're doing generally good things, and I should still want to go and support for the person that's going to do policies that I like. That's they're going to reward me. If I vote Republican when I want my taxes cut and I want less regulation, because that's going to be good for me. And that's sort of what are the private rewards for me that other people don't get. And if I happen to want to benefit from social services and things like that, I'd want to be pro the Democrats. But it's leaders in democracies generally are doing good things. They're not rounding people up and having them killed because they got to keep too many people happy and those kinds of policies. People don't want those kind of policies. They don't live in a country with those policies. So leaders don't do those policies. But we should remember King Leopold was a brutal murderer in one place and an enlightened liberal leader in another, just because he had different institutions. And then Aung San Suu Kyi was this wonderful person who got a Nobel Peace Prize for advocating for the downtrodden, right up until she trod down on the minority Rohingya group once she came to power. It's all about the incentives under which people serve.
Yep. Sorry, Bruce, I think I couldn't
he
hear you there.
inherited them.
Uh,
Leopold didn't choose the institutions in Belgium, he inherited them. He did choose the institutions in the Congo Free State. And he chose institutions where he depended on the force publique, a couple of hundred people, uh, to extract wealth. He didn't care how much they took for themselves as long as they delivered what he wanted. He became perhaps the richest man in Europe. Um, it worked for him. He followed the institutional incentives of the small coalition when he could get away with it. And he was a great liberalizer in Belgium, where he followed different rules because he had different institutional constraints.
and I guess, as we wrap things up, what are you guys working on now? I, I I find it just fascinating that the incentives, right? We don't think about that enough in terms of our leaders, right? Like, why are they doing X, Y, Z? I think intuitively we know when when people have a lot of money and power, it tends to, change people. But I guess it's just the same motivation, right? To gain more power, to gain more money, and so on.
So our current
In
work,
power. Well, I mean, we're
yeah,
at the moment we're doing a lot of work on sort of poverty traps and how do we lift countries out of poverty traps. And we all implicitly start with this idea that that's what people want to do. And Bruce and I are pushing back against that, and it's just not necessarily in people's interests. So, Robert Mugabe drove Zimbabwe into from a productive, exporting, sort of relatively economically well-off, people well-fed, and he drove it into, as a basket case. But he did very well out of it. And so we want to think about that. And we also like to think about, foreign aid. We think it's, nominally it's about making people better off. But we actually think it's just about buying political favors and giving money to dictators to do the policies that we want, enables them to not actually reform their countries at home and keeps their country poor. But they have enough money to pay off their supporters. So we're very cynical about how the world works. And just because we're cynical doesn't mean we're wrong, which is probably a very sad statement on the world. But that's the way we think.
On the plus side, we are trying to turn some of that cynicism into some positive consequences. So we are working on a general audience book, Let's End Poverty, that starts from the premises that we've established theoretically that leaders in authoritarian regimes have an incentive to keep their country poor, and then working out what needs to change for that to change. And it really comes down to what we've been talking about it is how big is the coalition and how productive is the society. This slope is steep when the society is productive and it's flat when it's not. The steeper it is, the more the coalition's interests align with the people's interests instead of the leaders. And that, even though the leader wants to keep people poor, he needs. So that's just really takes two dimensions, be a more democratic country and be a better educated country. That's what produces human capital and productivity. The countries that are high on above average on democracy and above average on productivity have 3 times the per capita income of countries that are high on one but not the other, and 10 times the per capita income of countries that are low on both. So it's not a mystery how to make people prosperous and have good lives. The mystery is to understand why leaders resist that and what we can do to change it.
And
That's what we're working on.
important for everyone else to realize what coalition they are in and to work toward strengthening that coalition, right? So, and hopefully it's in the masses' favor.
Yes.
Thank you both so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time. I will leave links to where everybody can find your books. I encourage people to read them, to understand better people's motivations and politics. I found it fascinating. So thank you again very much for your time. Thank you, Bruce and Alastair, for being guests on the foXnoMad podcast. And thank all of you for listening. And make sure wherever you're listening to this, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Google, everywhere you listen to podcasts, make sure you give the podcast a 5-star rating and a nice review always helps. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the like and subscribe buttons. That always helps us out there as well. Thank you again for listening and watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.